pal.
Hey there, this is Pete Townsend from Norio Ventures, and welcome to Money Never Sleeps, a podcast that looks inside the head of entrepreneurs and at the crossover of startups, enterprise, finance, technology, and life as we know it. This episode of Money Never Sleeps is sponsored by PAT FinTech, the training partner that demystifies fintech and digital finance for financial services professionals. We flipped the tables a bit this week, as my pal Ken Coyne from Ops Talent has his own podcast, Tech People, and he asked me to share some insights on blockchain and crypto on his show. Ken's thoughtful curiosity makes him a great interviewer, and he was intrigued by the initial hype around blockchain in the financial services space in 2015 to 2016. But then he saw things go quiet. So he asked me what happened and where things are going. So I shared my thoughts as best I could. Ken released the episode on his Tech People channel this week, and he's graciously given us the go-ahead to share the conversation with all of you, as this week's episode of Money Never Sleeps.
Money never sleeps, pal.
So welcome to the show, Pete.
Thanks, Ken. Awesome to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Been wanting to say that for a while.
You're definitely a professional, without a doubt.
I love it.
Delighted to have you on board. I'm really excited to talk about the whole area of blockchain and crypto today. But before we go into that, it would be great just to learn a bit more about you and who you are, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a startup advisor and early stage investor. I set up my business about 4 years ago in Dublin, based here in Dublin in Ireland for the last 15 years. Originally, as you can tell, not from these neck of the woods, as you are, Ken.
Not yet.
Not yet. I do have my citizenship that I got back in, I think, 2011 through my wife. So originally from Boston. And then after a great start to my career at Fidelity Investments, which is a fantastic place to start a career, I moved to Bermuda about 20 years ago, met my wife there, who's Irish. And when we got sick of the sandy beaches in Bermuda, as you do, just because it sticks to you. It sticks to you.
Right.
And it's annoying. And you just don't want to go anymore. So you know what we were doing? We were renting boats every Saturday afternoon for like $120 to go out. Right. And it was such just a waste of money. It's like to avoid going to the beach, to rent a little, 6-seater Boston whaler so you could have a little barbecue on these deserted islands or uninhabited islands.
Awful.
Oh, it's terrible. So I had always wanted to give Dublin a shot, and she's from Dublin. So we moved here in 2006. Did a 10-year stretch with BNP Paribas. Awesome experience working for the French. There's a little bit of a different way of doing things, and had a long stint from a COO role for the Dublin operations to a global role around alternative investment operations. But had a little bit of a wake-up call in 2014 that I can talk a bit more about, and led me to set up Norio Ventures in 2016. Set it up with a bit of hubris and naivete, thinking that the commercially friendly COO would just waltz out of BNP Paribas in 2016 in Dublin and set up a venture fund. But over the last 4 years, have been through a number of different experiences and stops and starts and getting it going. But what I do is that I work directly with startups themselves in a similar way that a venture capital partner would take a seat on a board of a company that they invest in, and basically you're increasing the odds of success. That's your aim, is increase the odds of success, increase the value of your investments. I do that as an advisor while I'm figuring out the right fundraising strategy for the eventual investments business. That has been a long time coming, but I think we finally nailed a strategy here to get it done.
Awesome. And you serve a number of boards, do you? I mean, it's not just your startups, but also some bigger companies also, is that correct?
Yeah. So I'm on the board of Coinbase here in Ireland, a couple of entities. I'm also on the board of a business called QPQ, who are a digital asset behemoth in the waiting, or in the building, shall I say. And if, really thinking about the next frontier of the capital markets and how that has become digital, and that a number of people are now seeing that opportunity and are moving quickly towards that next frontier. Also a business called Fund Admin Chain, who are building a digital investment funds platform or digital investment funds network for all of the players that you would find in the investment funds industry to operate digitally. Also a business called Olivia out of the US, who's set up here in Ireland. They're all of those wonderful user experiences that you would get out of the best fintech app in the world, but sitting on top of your existing bank account, right? So you can unite all of your existing bank accounts and get these artificial intelligence powered nudges about savings and spendings. I've become addicted to it just by using it. Also, Pipit out on the west coast of Ireland,
Yes. Yeah.
in Galway, from a tagline or value proposition perspective, they enable migrants to support their families back home cheaper and safer. But in a nutshell, it's basically digital cash remittance. So enabling really the conversion of hard currency, that it still is a thing out there in the world, especially in developing economies. But getting that cash back home from developed economies back to your friends and family, or where it needs to go in lesser developed countries, is really hard to do. There's a number of players out there who basically, just murder you with fees, and take a big chunk out of that. And Pipit are making it all possible built a great network around that. And also one fund board here in Ireland that has not launched yet, that we're still working on. But those are really the core that I'm working with.
It sounds pretty busy.
It is, but I'd say managing this on an advisory basis, combined with kind of the roles of the company director for those businesses that where they are a bit more established, rather than being early stage where they're more in the scale up phase or global growth phase, can be two different things, right? Where with one company you're working through some partnership discussions with who out there in the market might be suitable for them to work with to help get their product into more people's hands. Others, you're talking about staffing and finding key executives for their business, right? And some of the times it's getting right down into the weeds of how do we actually get a product to market? How do we establish a beachhead for customers? And how do we actually get this business funded, right? And it's really hard to do all three of those at the same time, because it's really hard to get customers without a product. It's really hard to get product without funding. It's really hard to get funding without customers. Yes. And it can be a continuous circle that just keeps going on and on and on. And you could either end up, rocketing up the Matterhorn or going down in the downward death spiral.
Yeah, big challenge, right? Definitely. Awesome, Pete. Listen, well, today I wanted to focus on the blockchain, the crypto piece, because I know you've done a lot of work in the space. You work with a lot of companies in the space. And it was very exciting a couple of years ago, and then it kind of went a bit quiet. And it would be good to learn, a bit more about what happened in the space, what's going on in the space. And we talk about some case studies. And also, why did you get interested in the whole area of blockchain and crypto?
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell a bit of a story around this one, which is a true story, which is always helpful, right? When you're sharing the word and sharing insights with folks. But if you think about, start with my own entry into the space, which has a nice parallel or timeline, at least, into how things have developed. In 2014, I was just completing the acquisition of a business from another bank when I was at BNP Paribas. And the big client that we needed to keep on board, right, in the business that was being acquired. And obviously, when you're acquiring a big business, you need to keep the biggest clients on board, keep them all on board if possible, but you got to keep the big one. So we invited the big one to Paris, and it was hilarious because they got stuck, had to be rerouted to a different airport. They eventually arrived, but we had wheeled out the big head of innovation for BNP Paribas to kind of try to give them a view into what we were thinking about for the future. And we got to page 47 of a 50-page deck that we were flying through because time was tight. And there were two words on that deck that I remember that I still see in my head. One was Bitcoin and the other was blockchain. And I kind of knew why Bitcoin was in the deck and thinking about the future of money, which is something that any innovation lab really would be looking into in the year 2014. Blockchain, I knew of it, but wasn't that familiar. So after the meeting, I'm like, I got to figure out what this is all about. So use this little tool called Google. You ever hear that?
Yeah, I heard it. Right.
Yeah, I went down the Google rabbit hole, and I started tracking it. And I still have the notes of the companies that I was tracking back in 2014. Some have stuck around and done well. I think Overstock was one of them. T0 was part of the Overstock group, and I kind of saw in front of me when I read the Satoshi Nakamoto white paper, which is the original Bitcoin white paper produced in the year 2009. I got to page 2 and I started to see a brand new framework for the capital markets, in front of my face. And it was not looking at things called Merkle trees in the Bitcoin white paper. It was just understanding the flow and understanding the transactions and how they all worked. And I'm like, okay, there's a direction to go in here. And I kind of, for my last, couple of years at BNP Paribas, I got quite involved in that space, met a great guy internally called Colin Platt. Shout out to Colin. He was head of blockchain for BNP Paribas corporate institutional banking. He and I connected, another American guy, and he and I are still pals. And he got me involved in the space. And I was just fascinated, met some great people that way. So by the time I left in 2016, I knew that if I'm going to build an investing business around my investment thesis, around my view of the next frontier of money, the next frontier of the capital markets, that distributed ledger technology is going to have a big piece in that. So, that was my entry, but running parallel to that, Ken, was Coinbase kind of building their business from, I think, 2012 forward. They went up well over 1 million users by the year 2014, 2015. Wow. R3 was formed in the year 2015.
Yes.
And R3 was kind of like, that guy in the innovation lab at BNP Paribas, Philippe Denis, I think that was his name. He would have gone out at the request of, the senior management and said, go investigate this and see, what's worth bringing back into the bank. And he and some, a couple of tech gurus came back and said, let's look at Bitcoin, right? Let's look at the Bitcoin blockchain, which is the only real, back in 2014, use case really for blockchain. And they came back saying, mining, consensus algorithms, how are we going to actually apply this to the capital markets? We don't need this stuff. And so a lot of other people besides just the guys at BNP Paribas had these conversations. And R3 was formed to bring a bunch of banks together, all with the same mindset that says, there are some really strong concepts here that can revolutionize the capital markets. Let's see how we can make that capital markets friendly, right? And that's where R3's product, Corda, started being developed. And what Corda has become is what some refer to as enterprise blockchain. And it's developed along a different arc and a different path than where what we call public blockchains have evolved since 2014, 2015. So that journey has meant that folks in the year, 2015, 2016 started opening their eyes to this. And like Bill Gates said, and I said this so many times, people always overestimate the impact of technology in the short run and underestimate its impact in the long run, right? And that happened. Okay. And we had a big trough of disillusionment that some folks are still in, and it really depends on where you are in the knowledge cycle. We went through the ICO craze in 2017, 2018, Bitcoin up to 20,000 or nearly 20,000, then the crash back down to 3,000. The revelation that 80% of ICOs were either frauds or failed, right? And there was so much negative sentiment created around this. It made it hard for folks that were developing some truly innovative solutions to get them to market, because you try to talk to an executive about blockchain or distributed ledger technology and their eyes gloss over. They think you're talking about Bitcoin. But I believe everything works on bell curves, Ken. And there are, coming out of all of this now into the year 2020, we now have enough people on the right-hand side of the bell curve that can see the same thing that I saw back in 2014, that a bunch of others saw since then, and even before that, the future of the financial markets, the foundation of that is distributed ledger technology. And it's not even the future, it's really the next frontier. And they're already, like I said before, pioneers out there on the frontier that are driving things forward. The best thing about this is we will know when it's mainstream, when people stop talking about blockchain. How often do you talk about TCP IP when you talk about e-commerce?
Sure, never.
Never. Right? So it will just be that, there is a critical mass of activity of, and I just like to say it, I just call it digital finance. It's just assets that only operate in the digital world, and they're not operating offline in analog form as they do today. But that's a much, much longer story to get into.
Talk us, it's very interesting. Talk us through some, companies and case studies. Maybe give us some examples of what's happening currently in the marketplace and what's going well.
Yeah, so one to talk about is Fund Admin Chain. I'm an advisor to them, like I mentioned. And what they're doing is realizing that in the investment funds world, you've got investment funds that are holding digital assets. The thing is, you still need to account for them in an old-fashioned way. you still need to hold them in these old fund structures and that operate on a paper prospectus. It almost feels, when you step back, it's a bit nonsensical that they still need to operate. It's like putting a incredibly hyped up stereo into a 1982 Ford Escort. And I actually did that once. And it was stolen. It was stolen by Bob Toth. Thanks, Bob. But what fund admin chain or FAC are doing in a nutshell, like I said, is building a digital funds network for the launching and trading of digital investment funds, targeted at the top 500 asset managers globally, and bringing it back to the lowest common denominator, not the individual assets of the fund, but the fund structure itself. How do we create that in digital form? And it's operating on R3's Corda as the core of the FAC network, and using digital assets, basically fiat currency linked tokens, or stable coins as they're sometimes referred to transact on the network. You can only use those in the network, and you use these cash tokens to buy funds, and the funds themselves are issued in digital form. They're one of the ones that I'm working with. Also QPQ, as I mentioned, you can take a big view on QPQ and say that they're building a digital universe, right? Which is a massive view, or you can bring it right back to some of the the problems in the market right now in the capital markets, in that you have assets that are issued in analog form or in fiat form. You have assets that are issued in digital form. How can you actually get a digital issuance to market quicker, get it to market where you are realizing all the benefits of having that asset issued digitally, and also be able to operate across different digital asset platforms? There's a concept called interoperability, which is one of the hardest nuts to crack in the blockchain or DLT space. And there's that is one of the key first problems that QPQ are solving, right? Is the interoperability problem, which is going to be great to see that happen. Also, one of the other ones, Archax out of London, are building a digital asset exchange. Graham Rodford is the founder of that business. I had him on my podcast, Money Never Sleeps, but a little over a year ago. They are the first regulated digital asset exchange in London or in the UK. Okay. And this business came from a realization back a few years ago that Graham had, and the guys that he founded the business with, that, they wanted to start investing in cryptocurrency in the investment funds, the institutional investment funds they managed, but couldn't do it because the market infrastructure just wasn't there. So how do we go build that instead? Right. So they just got their first part of their licensing back a couple months ago from the FCA. And this has really gone beyond crypto to, again, like we said, assets being issued digitally. So where they live and breathe as tokens, right? Rather than paper-based products. When I say paper-based products, there's obviously that acceptance that they're actually, they operate in electronic form. But one of the biggest things that digital assets enable is that you've got one golden record of that asset and where it exists and where it lives. Now, it's a distributed record, right? So that everybody doesn't have to keep their own records, but that's one of the big impacts here. So when you are issuing assets digitally, when you're trading assets digitally, either in initial issuance or into the secondary markets, being able to do that where you've got this incredibly efficient operating model around that just brings everybody to the party. This episode of Money Never Sleeps is sponsored by PAT Fintech, demystifying fintech and digital finance for financial services professionals. PAT Fintech enable financial services professionals to transform their capabilities into the digital age, with dedicated virtual training programs geared towards those that can develop, deliver, and monitor optimally customized user experiences balanced by appropriate governance, control, and oversight. To learn more about PAT Fintech, go to moneyneversleeps.ie/PAT Fintech.
I remember also there was a number of challenges in terms of blockchain, the technology itself. And it's also linked to the whole piece of data mining. And was it slow to operate in terms of the dealing with the transactions and number of volumes? Could you talk us through some of the challenges, and are there still challenges?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, because what's happened in the last couple of years is that, blockchain has split off into two channels, right? There's enterprise blockchain, which is where you have private permission network like FAC, where there is one person that says you can come into the network or you cannot come into the network, right? And there is this, centralization, even though it is a decentralized network, but it's a centralized gate to get in, right? And those type of private permissioned blockchains are operating without the consensus algorithms, without the mining, without, in order for a block to be completed, you need this very technical mathematical exercise to be completed, right? That doesn't happen with private permission blockchains or enterprise blockchains. Okay. When you're talking about the Bitcoin blockchain, absolutely. That still has, although it's significantly evolved over the last 11 years, it is still slow. It is still, very, very complicated and requires a lot of electricity to actually mine assets, right? Requires a lot of electricity to run the entire blockchain. If you look at other public blockchains such as Ethereum, they're now going through an upgrade to Ethereum 2.0. I haven't dug into that in as much detail as some of the other topics, but there is the expectation that will enable an increase in volume and increase in throughput. And of course, with blockchains, people talk about exchanges getting hacked. It's not the blockchain that gets hacked; it's the gate into that, right? So you have the Bitcoin blockchain, you have the Ethereum blockchain, you have whatever. On top of that, you have an asset. So on the Bitcoin blockchain, you have just Bitcoin, and there's some other Bitcoin Cash and a few others. On top of the Ethereum network, you have loads and loads and loads of different assets. Okay, and ERC20 tokens are used to create so many different types of digital assets, and there's a big DeFi theme that's pretty significant in the market right now that I won't get into, but the overall approach is that above, that layer, you have some pretty standard technology created around exchanges that you need to get through, that you log into, that you have an account that is entirely hackable, right? There's key management themes that you need to consider, but mostly for any of these hacks that have taken place, it has been through kind of a non-blockchain driven risk. It's just the risk of cybersecurity and those types of things. Now, there was a couple recently with Ethereum Classic blockchain where there was the whole idea is that if you get more than 51% of the nodes to collude, you can actually take over the chain and which can result in some fraud. And that happened with Ethereum Classic, which is a much smaller, the original Ethereum chain. But that's gone through the news cycles in the last couple of months, and no one's really talking about it anymore.
So they're addressing, they're getting past all these challenges now, basically.
Yeah.
Wow. And in terms of, the big banks, so are you seeing a lot of activity in terms of these financial institutions, and what are they investing heavily still in this space?
Yeah. Again, it depends on where they are in the cycle, right? Okay. Are they still a couple years behind, right? And are still coming out of the ICO phase? And that's, it's where you are in the news cycle, right? Where your research is, where your internal development capabilities are. So yes, to answer your question, there are still big banks investing in this. And there are, especially where I see the most interest and take up is out of Asia, just because Asia are, a couple years ahead of us here in the West. In terms of technology adoption, and also because of the way that they've kind of almost skipped the queue in moving from creation of this very, affluent middle class that, a lot of financial services were just created on a mobile basis, and they don't have all this old legacy infrastructure to deal with. Right? And Asians are likely to be the first one to market with their own central bank digital currency. One of the big topics out there right now.
Incredible, Pete. So where is it going for the future? Sounds like it's really pick up steam now again from what you're telling me. What does the future hold?
Yeah, it's, I think the best thing about this is that the steam never subsided in the development community, right? And in the startup community. It's just been the perception of these things in the institutional community, and that the smart money has always kept an eye on this. And what I like to say is, the first thing about a blockchain startup is don't say the word blockchain, right? Don't say the word
Okay.
distributed ledger technology, because that's just your infrastructure. Your value proposition is, reducing friction. It's creating new revenue channels, reducing cost, taking headaches away. But you really do need to stress the revenue creation as being one of the big things. So, where I see it all going, I think it's going to continue on along the themes really for the last 18 months. This whole DeFi craze, a lot of people look at that and say, well, it's kind of like feels a bit scammy.
Right.
But I see that as kind of the building blocks. So then the next phase, we got to go through these experimentations in the market. ICOs, for all their, comedic intent, resulted in security token offerings, right? Which are issuing legitimate securities digitally as tokens that folks like Archax are trading. Folks like QPQ are able to support the creation of and the issuance of, so I see that continuing. I think we're going to see this nice convergence really between being able to put digital assets into the individual's hands and putting digital assets into the capital markets. And that each one of those are going to move at pace, perhaps individually for a while. But the best thing about that is that the infrastructure is exactly the same, right? And that there's a connecting piece in the middle that I think that is developing that I'm going to hopefully keep my eye on closely, called regulation, right? Which is the market in crypto assets, new proposed regulation that came out a few weeks ago, or the draft of that came out a few weeks ago. It's going to take a few years to implement, a few years to negotiate. Maybe within 3 or 4 years it'll be live, but it's really going to level the playing field, at least in Europe, so that digital asset players know the rules that they can play by, right? So I see regulation continuing to build, and I see the best results from the players in this space coming from those who can embrace the regulation and really be able to kill 3 birds with one stone, which is being able to address market regulations such as MiFID, e-money, and what is now being called MiCA or MiCA, market in crypto assets, all in one way. Or if you're exposed to something like UCITS or the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive, you're able to work one or other of the both into your overall business strategy to be able to say, how am I going to be able to meet all of these regulatory needs by operating a financial services business that is also operating within digital assets? I think that's just going to become the norm. And what's the good thing about this new proposed regulation is that it's suggesting that there's a number of regulatory regimes out there that just don't fit with digital assets, and we're going to have to address all of those one by one. And I think that we're going to see that continue.
Fascinating, Pete. Really is fascinating. Listen, tell us, so for you in the future, I know you continue to invest in companies, I guess, in the blockchain space. Yep. What do you look for when you look for these kind of startups? If the company's interested in reaching out to you, what are you looking for?
Yeah, I look for deep firsthand experience in the problem they're solving, right? Do they know their market inside and out? Are they talking about the value that they're delivering rather than the architecture that they're using? What does their team look like? Where do they come from? Obviously, firsthand experience with the problem you're solving is critical, but do you have a well-diversified team of people that like each other, right? And that like to work together and want to build something together and are in it for the long haul? I saw a great quote from a founder the other day that said, "Don't worry about my mental will and my resilience. I've got both in buckets, and there's no bottom to either one of those buckets," right? So, that's kind of what I'm looking for. Those with, people talk about technical founders, those that have a challenge getting a product to market. I really like technical founders. But also I really like commercial founders as well, because they've got this great enthusiasm and about getting out there and selling their product. And they're bigger risk takers and are willing to just go be embarrassed, right? Because they're trying to sell something that just isn't positioned right, but they know it's part of the process. Those that are willing to take no for an answer from investors and learn to love that no. We talked about that on our podcast, Money Never Sleeps, last week, that I think it's 1% or 10% of the meetings that you're going to have with investors actually may lead to a check. So unless you're trying to get some good insights out of the VCs, when you're meeting them, you're going to waste 90% of your meetings, right? So you got to plug into that pretty quickly and know if it's likely to be a no. And if it's going to be a no, try to get something else out of that meeting. And it was the guys at NFX, a great venture firm out of California, that penned a piece on that got me thinking about that. And Owen Fitzgerald and I from the podcast, we talked about that in depth.
Yeah, awesome. Actually, you might mention that actually. So the podcast that listeners can listen to more about topics you're covering and also how they reach you. Please, Pete.
Absolutely. So Money Never Sleeps is a weekly podcast where we get inside the minds of entrepreneurs and also look at the crossover of startups, enterprise, finance, technology, and life as we know it. That's moneyneversleeps.ie. You can find it on all your major podcast platforms. Big thing with that, it's all one word. And that was the way that, is there a movie called Money Never Sleeps? Yes, but it's 3 words. The podcast is spelled as one word. Okay, so we're okay there. And also just to get in touch with me, my business is Norio Ventures and my email is pete@norioventures.com.
Fantastic, Pete. Listen, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really enjoyed the chat.
My pleasure, Ken. Thank you. That does it for this week, folks. And thanks to Ken Coyne for letting us share this with all of you, our loyal listeners. Links and show notes for this episode are on moneyneversleeps.ie, including how to get in touch with Ken and Ops Talent. So check us out online. Also, you can subscribe to our Money Never Sleeps newsletter at moneyneversleeps.substack.com. If you're enjoying Money Never Sleeps and want to see it continue, make sure you hop on over to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star review. And don't forget Conan Brophy from Create Sound. He mixes and edits each episode for us and is an excellent media man to get in touch with when you're thinking about launching your own podcast. As for me, I help startups get their products to market, get customers, and finance their vision. You can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or at norioventures.com, and you can also follow Owen Fitzgerald on Twitter at OwenFitzgerald9. Finally, till next time, thanks for listening. See ya!
Money never sleeps, pal.